Hello, Ray. Thank you for joining the internal communications spotlight series that I run on my blog. This is with thought leaders to understand various nuances and aspects of internal communications. I've spoken to leaders on culture, executive presence, change management, and I'm very delighted to have you speak about localizing employee communications, which you are an advocate of. So before we get started, it'll be great if you could quickly introduce yourself for our viewers.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Uh, my name is Ray Walsh. I have been a writer my entire career. I've been in corporate communications for the last 20, and most of that, I am American from the central U.S., and I moved to Europe, I guess, about 13 years ago. So most of my corporate career has, in fact, been in Europe, and most of that has actually been outside of the corporate headquarters, supporting a kind of, supporting the global function, but from a virtual place. And so I've written. I consider myself a writer by profession, but I've since moving to Europe, I would say most of my focus has been on internal communications, occasionally
Mhm.
marketing, but mostly internal.
Fantastic, fantastic. And you authored a book on the subject of localizing employee communications. And so that's my first question, really. I mean, why do you think is it really a big deal? Because I thought it's a given mostly in multinationals that you need to localize content or at least think about the local culture and nuances. So what's your take on that?
I 10 years ago, I got a job in corporate communications in a European headquarters, and they were the ones that introduced me to the concept of localization. To be
Right.
honest, until that point, I thought of the communications department was the communications department, and they are the seer of all truths. Uh, but what we would do in that European headquarters was create content, and then we would hand it off to the countries. Some of
Mhm.
those countries had resources to manage the content, but many of them it was just it, our request was simply, localize this, do with it what you will, translate it if you will, adapt it if you will, but it was really we left it up to them. And
Right.
there was some mixed success with that. The countries that were able to manage it were able to, but
Mhm.
many of them were not. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the
Mhm.
time because we didn't give them enough time, and they
Mhm.
didn't have the skills or
Mhm.
background to really adapt content. So companies, that was a little about just about 10 years ago, and companies that I've been with or supported since, I see a similar kind of approach. They just hand it off to the countries, and it's really up to the countries to or business units to manage it. And I think it
Mhm.
really leads to some problems. And I can give you an example of that. I was
Mhm.
supporting a global plastics manufacturer, and they had
Mhm.
manufacturing plants. Not a huge company, but they had plants all over the world. And the
Right.
communications director, and it was a European company, not an American one. And she told me plastics manufacturing is a high tech environment. Uh, Everybody's educated. Everybody speaks English. We really don't need to manage multiple language versions at all.
Mm.
And a few weeks later, I went to their Belgian plant and I sat down with the site director and I asked him about the corporate communications that he was receiving from us for employees, and he looked confused. He said, "No, I don't share any of that." And then he went on to explain that Belgium has a local labor law that says that
Mhm.
line level employee communications has to be in local language.
Right.
Now, in fact, I think he was maybe interpreting that law a bit strictly. Nevertheless, it resulted in something that I've just recently started calling shadow localization. I'm
Mm.
borrowing the term from shadow IT, and those are the IT solutions that people find, outside of the corporate network. And
Right.
shadow localization is really happening a lot more than I think corporate communicators realize. And in fact, in that Belgian plant, because they didn't share any of our global materials, they created their own. They had their own newsletter in
Right.
Dutch language, and I could see just the visual look and feel wasn't up to the company's brand,
Right.
and maybe that's not such a huge problem, but
Mm.
but but because they're producing it on their own, completely
Mm.
unbeknownst to corporate, they're also missing out on, and I think this is something I've heard you write about,
Yeah.
and that is they're outside of best practice. And in
Right.
fact, sometimes local business units get sued because they use an image from the internet because they didn't understand usage rights.
Yeah.
So the company's really at risk for being off message, off brand, maybe even in legal troubles.
Right, right, brilliant. I mean, that's a great insight. And what according to you are the biggest reasons why organizations don't think about localizing content from an employee comms perspective?
I think the companies you've been involved with may be more progressive than the ones I've seen. I think that at least from most American global multinationals don't want to spend a lot of money on internal communications, and
Mm.
localization adds a level of complexity. It may add
Right.
expense, and they just really would rather not bother with it. But um, so budget is definitely an issue, but I think maybe the main issue is the headquarters mentality, the headquarters silo. They're really
Mm.
not used to collaboration. They're used to creating, broadcasting, and everybody else just take. They're used to cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking these initiatives for a very long time, and then they get
Right.
delayed as they go through approvals, and then there's time pressure, and they just push it out, not giving
Yeah,
the local countries and business units enough time to really react.
got it, got it. And so what do you think can be done to fix this? And what exactly do you think must be done to change that mindset?
I think it is really a mindset, and I come from a journalism background, and I come from a time when corporate communications really was like a central newsroom, and it's a great model, but I really think that the world has shifted,
Mm.
technology has shifted, and I think that
Right,
we as communicators need to get out of that centralized newsroom model. We need to
right.
think less about the content we can create, and more
Mm.
the kind of communications we can enable. When you look
Right.
at the whole context of what the employee experience is, we're actually asking for user generated content. We're expecting them
Mm.
to use channels like Yammer, and then
Yeah,
all the software as a service functions that they're using, like I don't know, ServiceNow or Workday. These are
yeah,
available in multiple languages, which I think
exactly.
even lowers the interest in our content even more, because their whole experience can be much more local and in local language. So I think, we're as corporate communicators, we're a bit behind the times, and I think we need to catch up.
Got it. Got it. And is there a way, I mean, based on your research and your study in terms of localizing employee comms, is there a way in which this can be measured? I mean, what's the way in which you know it's really working, and how can measure the value of this?
I think that localization will be an investment, if not in actual money, certainly time. So I
Mm.
think measurement is really critical. It's really important. And I think that the temptation for those of us in corporate communications who come from content backgrounds, the
Mm.
temptation is for us is to measure content,
Mm.
content engagement. And if I saw this at my employer from 10 years ago, when we did adapt to Germany and France, we did see an uptick in content. And I think companies that take this on will see more content engagement.
Right.
Maybe that's important, maybe it's not. I think that an important question would be business outcomes, and how can we
Mm.
actually how can we enable the business. um, what that plastics company at the time, we were creating a lot of content around safety and the importance of safety, but at
Right.
the same time there were a lot of accidents in India
Right.
that kept happening, and this is so something's happening, and the question is what can we as communicators do. Now they had an award-winning series of posters on safety, but
Right.
apparently the posters weren't working, and so there was some kind of communication breakdown, and clearly there was no language barrier in that
Mm.
company, or even India being an English speaking country wasn't
Right.
understanding something else is going on. So I think we need to get with the local management and find out how can we support, and of course listen. Maybe communications has no role whatsoever. I think the final in the end we will be a complement to what's going on, but we won't be the driver of better safety results. But I think
Right.
that in that conversation we can mutually agree on some measurement, some
Mm.
baseline that we can establish, and then measure our
Right.
success over time.
Brilliant. And I'm curious to know more about the book that you wrote. And I'm assuming the genesis of that was the fact that you moved to Europe and you were working there, and that's how you really understood the difference between headquarter communication and local communication. So can you talk us through a bit on how you thought about the book and what's there in the book?
Right. Yeah. That you described it well. That is exactly what the impetus, the inspiration. I later I learned the word localization as an industry, so I started to look into the industry. What could we as internal communicators learn from them?
Mm.
For the most part, I would say they're focused on customers and sales communications, and
Right.
localizing for selling products and supporting products all around the world. and they are much more ahead of us in terms of this question. So I originally started my research and interviews on what can we learn in adapting content for language and culture. But over time, I'm realizing, well, actually, there's quite a bit of difference within a company just based on business units. So the automotive practice might be have very different needs than the healthcare practice. So so adapting it for the team level, for the functional level, even if it's all staying in English, there's still quite a bit of localization going on. And I think it's still a very good question for us. What can we as communicators do to help line level managers make that adaptation?
Got it. Got it. And I'm also interested to know your thoughts. There are multiple generations now in the workplace, and especially Gen Z. And so how do you think about localization when it comes to them? And you mentioned briefly about user-generated content. So what's your thinking around that?
One of the people I interviewed told me that younger people really grew up in a digital age where they expect interactivity. It's really their expectation. Okay. So I think that channels like Yammer, internal channels, or even external social, there is going to be that highly individualistic, highly personalized, highly participatory experience. And I'm much more of a generation where we manage. We were so. My generation and previous was so concerned with message consistency and messaging discipline, and I still think that's important. And I think we have we have something to teach communicators. But I do think that we need to let go a little bit and trust a little more, and really, and I think listen to those younger digital savvy people about what they expect from communication channels.
Great. And so as we wrap up, Ray, just want to ask you, what is your advice for communicators globally in terms of how they should be thinking about local communications?
So I guess it goes both ways: the communicators in the headquarters, as well as the communicators in the local office. But speaking generally from the headquarters perspective, I would say get to know the local network of communicators, whether they're doing it whether they're fully dedicated or if they're doing it just sort of on an ad hoc basis. Get to know them personally, meet with them, find out what they can do. You never know that somebody has video editing capabilities unless you actually get to talk with them. So that's number one. And then the second most important thing is, from the headquarters perspective, is to involve them in planning. Even if you just have an idea, well, we don't know, but in Q3 we're thinking about possibly. Talk to them now about it. So get them thinking about what the possibilities are, and involve them, because they can really prevent a lot of problems further down the road. And then also, I think looking at it from the other perspective, the local countries, I don't think they should be so passive and waiting for perfect to come from headquarters. And they should be much more questioning and much more, the people in headquarters, they're famous for being out of touch and in their silo, but in fact they do know some things. they know the company strategy, and they know best practice. And I think if we look at them as gurus, as kind of we can share best practice and local insight and find the kind of collaboration that I think will be much more effective.
Brilliant, brilliant. This has been fantastic, Ray. I think these are great insights, and it's very unique because not many people talk about localizing employee comms, and I think that you've really touched upon a very interesting topic which will be valued by a lot of people. So thank you again for taking the time to doing this.
I hope so, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Great, thank you.